In this video, in honor of Father's Day, I want to talk about an issue that's a little bit different than what I've done in my other videos. I want to talk about an issue that's important to fathers, and I think to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as a whole right now, and that relates to uh, the youth and how can we be more successful as parents for our youth, and in particular, how can the church retain a higher percentage of its youth. And in particular, I want to talk about the effect of public schools potentially on youth retention, because it's an issue that I've been thinking about a lot lately. A few months ago, there was a state conference that I attended, and in it, one of the issues that came up was a declining retention of youth. Now, I understand the church is growing on an overall basis, but in the United States, there have been some declines in retention of youth. Now, it's not well documented, and the percentages are a little bit unclear, but I think it's clear enough that I think you could assume that there's been a 10 to 20%, at least, somewhere in that type of range, in terms of a drop of retention of youth as they go through the high school and college years. I know that there's been some studies, not completely up to date. Some show that, for example, whereas we used to retain, and again, the numbers vary, but maybe it was retaining two-thirds or three-fourths of the youth. Now it's somewhere closer to maybe a half of the youth, or maybe a little over half. But regardless of what the detail in the numbers is, I do think that there has been a decline in retention of youth in the United States, and I think there's a lot of anecdotal observations of that as well. It seems to fit most people's observations and what they're seeing. So the question is, why is that? Now, in this event that we had a few months ago, like I said, in a state conference event, there was a discussion of, in our particular area, what they had seen was about a 10% decline in youth retention, and they were seeing it stronger in the young women than the young men even. So whereas it used to be there was a higher retention of young women than of young men through those teenage years into adulthood, now they're actually seeing a lower retention of young women than of young men. Both had declined, but the young women had declined even more rapidly. And there was a lot of discussion of that and what could be done, and most of the conversations focused on things that could be done better at home and in the church. But one of the things that got me thinking since then is the effect of the public schools, because anecdotally, what I've seen is that, I'm familiar with some families that homeschool, as well as obviously a high number that go through public school. And I've noticed that there's a difference, that there seems to be a higher percentage of retention among those that homeschool. And I've thought a lot about to what extent do public schools affect youth retention? Is that something that church members should be thinking about, that we should be thinking about for ourselves, whether you have your own children going through school, or maybe grandchildren, or whatever it may be? Is that something that we should think about? Now, logically, it does make sense that public schools are going to have some effect. Obviously, the church has, with its seminary program, tries to counteract that somewhat. But in the public schools, the youth are going to be exposed to not only a lot of other non-members and other belief systems, but what you'll find if you pay attention to what's going on in the public schools is that it really does push and normalize things that are contrary to things that the church teaches. And what do I mean by that? Well, for example, when your kids are going to school, what they'll have is teachers, peers, and pretty much everyone else around them advocating ideas that essentially lead to conclusions that believing in God or the biblical stories is foolish or dumb, that there's no basis for that, that any reasonable or enlightened person isn't going to believe those, maintain those religious beliefs. And in addition, they're going to hear narratives about how the past is bad, tradition is bad, church is bad, religion is bad, and the victimization type of narratives that you get from that. Now, for me, I mean, with our children, you'll see them like when they went through AP English, and you see the reading materials that they get, or through some of the other courses that they had. The reading materials, I was shocked that it's not the same classics that they were getting anymore, but pretty much every book had a strong agenda pushing identitarian, anti-traditional type of narratives, whether it's feminist narratives against patriarchy, or race narratives against systemic racism, or other types of dystopian narratives against tradition, or the past, or the traditional beliefs and values. And so it really is a strong push that you get from the materials that they read. And then the teachers that they have, they had quite a number of teachers that would push narratives that would be contrary to traditional values and belief, traditional understandings, biblical understandings, and so forth. And so it's really hard to maintain beliefs through that. Now, anecdotally, I see that, and logically I see that, but I became curious to see whether there are any studies that showed the effect of public schools on religious beliefs, retention in religion, and in particular with the LDS Church. And the answer is there's really not specifically with the LDS Church, but it's essentially the same things at play with other Christian denominations. And there have been some studies, not many, but some that have looked at the effects of public schools and changes in religious education on what that's had in terms of a retention with Christian beliefs. And let me share a couple of those with you. I'm going to share with you one study that in particular caught my attention and I think is significant. And it's called Can Schools Change Religious Attitudes? And it's looking at evidence from the German society with its changes in its public education system. It's a January 2022 paper. And what makes this an interesting study in particular is that there are some things that happened with German society that make it an especially good place to study differences. Because what happened is after World War II, Germany for a couple of decades had required religious education in its public schools. And, what they would do is you were required to have some religious education, and it could be Catholic or Protestant. And then the way that they had it worked was that the Catholic Church would certify teachers that could teach Catholic principles and doctrine to the students in their school time, or the Protestant Lutheran side, they could do the same thing and certify teachers. So you had these sort of church certified teachers that would teach in the schools, and they would teach religious beliefs, religious education. And that existed for over 20 years after World War II. And then in the 70s, there started to be changes, but it didn't happen all at once. Instead, different regions of Germany implemented changes at different times. And so what happened is that some of these different regions, one by one, they started to implement changes where instead of just having religious education, they started to allow a third substitute, which was sort of a secular values, non-religious alternative, a sort of a values-based alternative. And so instead of the Catholic or the Protestant choice, you could choose a sort of philosophy-based, secular, values-based, non-religious choice. And since these were implemented at different times in different parts of Germany, what it allowed these researchers to do, and since it's been some time as that happened over time, they were able to go back and look at changes that occurred in terms of the people and the effects in their adult life from the removal of the religious education. And what they found was that there were significant changes, and so I'll just show uh, from the abstract here, as it said that once the youth stopped receiving the religious education in their schools, the result was there was significantly reduced religiosity in adulthood that they were able to track. And it also, they found reduced religious actions like personal prayer, church going, church membership. And in addition to that, they also found um, complete changes in societal views and life. They found fewer marriages and children, and changes in gender roles were accelerated. And all of this, now you might say, well, this happened over time. This would have happened anyway. But because they have different time frames that they're looking at in these different parts of Germany, they are able to mathematically, eliminate placebo effects and things that would have happened anyway, and basically narrow it down to focus on what was the effect caused by the change in the schools when you no longer have a religious education in your school, in the children's education, the youth's education, and the effect. And they found significant effects, like I said, in religiosity, in biblical beliefs, in going to church, in prayer, belief in God, um, and in family roles, in family formation, fewer marriages, fewer children, and so forth. And so it's really an interesting study that shows that. Now, unfortunately, like I said, there haven't been studies specifically showing this kind of thing related to comparing public schools in the United States um, versus other formats for religious schools and homeschooling. Except there is one study. I'll show this one. So this is it's a School Types in Adolescence, and what they did was they studied children of nurses, and this is in the United States, and they studied from those children of nurses over time. They looked at whether they went to public schools, whether they went to kind of religious charter type schools, or whether they were homeschooled. And what they found in this particular study was that there was some difference between those attending homeschools and those attending religious schools, but the differences there were not huge. I mean, they were getting some differences there in terms of those attending religious schools staying religious and staying in religion. But where they really saw the difference was with homeschooling, because whereas with religious schools, there was a few percent type of difference, with homeschools, it was like 50% type difference. That the homeschooled students were over 50% more likely to continue to attend religious services frequently, and these other types of factors, including sense of mission in life and lower sexual activity and so forth. So those things have caused me to ponder and make me think that as fathers, and whether or as a grandparent or for your own children, any parent, maybe we should be thinking more about, is a public school the best choice for our students? And I think it will sometimes depend on your particular public school and on your particular child, what would benefit them or not. But I think it should be more of a prayerful situation. As you know, most LDS youth go through public schools now. And one thing I hear is that, well, you have to go through those kind of things, and it's good for them to go and have their beliefs challenged. And I think, yes, that can be true. But but in part, I worry that sometimes we're putting children and youth who are really not ready for the level of pressure and challenge that they're going to get to their beliefs in public school, and that's being done before they're ready for it. And the counter would be, well, work to try to get them ready for it. And that's true, but just the nature of public school again, with the way that there there is so much pressure against belief, against tradition. I mean, you go into these schools and the youth are essentially taught that religion's bad, biblical beliefs are stupid, the traditional way of doing things, the patriarchy, the system, the systemic racism, victims of the patriarchy and gender roles, that your parents are bad, and they really are turned against church, against their parents, against traditional values and beliefs. It's very hard to withstand that. One of the one of the parables that Jesus gave in the New Testament, in Matthew 13, the parable of the sower, there's a line from that it comes to me anyway. And this is when the parable of the sower, when he goes forth to sow, and he talks about, well, some seeds fall by the wayside and they're eaten up with fowls, some stony places, some with the sun. And it's like some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprung up and choked them. This to me visually is like what happens to so many of the youth in the church as they go through public schools, particularly in places where you are unique and have very few around you who are members of the church. You go in and you're essentially like the seeds that are drowned among the thorns, where it's you are just completely surrounded, and it's hard to come out without essentially having your independence choked out of you. And it's sad. Now, in the Come Follow Me lessons, the Doctrine and Covenants, a couple of weeks ago, there was a part in D&C section 55 that stuck out to me. And this is when they just are in Kirtland, settling in Kirtland the year after the church was formed. And Joseph Smith in section 55, verse 4, tells Oliver Cowdery to go about selecting and writing books for schools in this church, that little children may receive instruction before me as is pleasing unto me. And I'm not saying that the church should have church schools. Maybe they should think about it. But what stuck out to me about this is the importance that children receive instruction that is pleasing unto God. And I think that, we have a seminary program, we've got primary program, we've got the Sunday, but those are just such a small part of the week compared to the number of hours that they are receiving instruction in public schools, that much of which instruction is not going to be pleasing to God. And it's something to think about. So those are my thoughts. So happy Father's Day. Thank you, fathers, for all you do in raising your children. I wish you God's blessing in doing your best to raise those children. I hope that we can lose fewer and fewer of our children to worldly philosophies. And I encourage you to just think about it. Think about just like with so many things in life, it's important to be intentional and know what choice we're actually making, instead of just sort of having our choices made for us. So instead of sort of just having our choices made for us and continuing on the course that we have, I would like us to maybe take a step back and intentionally make a decision and think, what is the best course for your particular child, or whoever it may be that you're watching out for, to decide what is the best course for them, whether it may be homeschooling, public schooling, charter school, or whatever may work out best for that child. I encourage you in those efforts. Thanks.